Chapter 2, Biomechanics. So with this section, just make sure to keep in mind that the goal with biomechanics is looking at the body as a machine. Okay, machines are, we'll see levers, pulleys, and wheels and axles. Those are the three types of machines in the body. Levers are going to be the bones, muscles attaching to them, and the working of those together basically allows for the body to move. And how this is accomplished is we get into mechanical advantage. Mechanical advantage is where more force is able to be applied to overcome a resistance. So when you're going through this chapter, just keep in mind thinking that our goal is to know, okay, human movement, and then biomechanics is the study of essentially how that movement takes place within the human body. Looking at the body as a machine and how this body or this machine is able to accomplish that movement. In a lot of ways, and I'll bring this up again, but biomechanics is the link between physiology and actual movement. You really can't have so much, you can't look at movement with only ex-phys. You have to bring in biomechanics in there as well. Because it really does add into the understanding as us as exercise scientists, overall kinesiologists, and just trying to understand the movement itself. Okay, so just going through this chapter, keep in mind what we're talking about, and that is looking at the body as a machine, how it accomplishes movement. Chapter 2, Biomechanics of Resistance Exercise. So the biggest thing to keep in mind within this unit, and really when you're looking at strength and conditioning overall, is we're looking at how do we get the body to move? Because that's when within this field, we're going, all right, we want the body to move, but then within strength and conditioning, how can we get the body to move in a more efficient, more powerful, more explosive way? And to understand all that, we kind of need to know some basic concepts of biomechanics, looking at more or less the body as a machine, because the body it's a living machine as opposed to like our cars, which are not living, of course, but you know what I mean, is that we forget that the body has the same principles, the same concepts, the same applications as any other machine. It's just this one is a living machine as opposed to non-living like our cars. Okay, and so the point of a machine is to try and gain, as I introduced in the intro, is getting a mechanical advantage. Okay, mechanical advantage is what allows you to overcome a resistance. And when we're able to move, as the body's moving, there's where we know we have a mechanical advantage because the body is moving itself. And if there is no movement, then no overcoming of the mechanical advantage essentially took place. Okay, I'll get into describe all that, explain all that coming up here in a bit. But just to keep in mind, to kind of understand, think of the body as a machine in this chapter. And biomechanics really is that link between exercise physiology and movement. And as a strength coach, you have to have both. Strength coaching, strength and conditioning, the field, you need to have both areas, have an understanding of both areas. Often, too many times, I feel in kinesiology, we overlook biomechanics. We tend to look just at exercise physiology. Most programs are heavy on the exercise phys, not so much on the biomechanics. Okay, and so within our field, we need to have more of this understanding, the understanding how a body moves, because when it comes to athletics, the more efficient the body can move, the stronger, the more explosive. Overall, the better athlete you will be. Okay, so getting this chapter, that's what we'll be talking about is movement itself and how to overcome a resistance that allows them to begin to move. So some objectives, look at the major components of the skeletal musculature, differentiate the various types of levers of the musculoskeletal system, the primary anatomical movements, the sport activities and exercises. We're not going to really look at linear and rotational work and power in terms of calculation. The book talks about it in there, but have an understanding of essentially linear and rotational work and power. More definitions on this. Look at the factors contributing to human strength and power. Evaluate resistive force and power patterns of exercise devices, and identify the factors of importance for joint biomechanics with exercise. So, biomechanics, the mechanisms through which components interact to create movement. When you see the word mechanic, you always think of kind of a machine. And so machines, I can simply think they just move. Okay, then you see the word bio, living. And so just think of biomechanics as looking at the body as a machine and looking at how that then allows for this machine, this human living machine, to be able to move. In order to accomplish that, two major parts, as we just said in the objectives, is the skeletal musculature. So looking at skeleton system and the muscular system. The working of those two together allows for movement to occur. So with muscles, though, you have the prime movers, which agonist, and that's the muscle most directly involved in bringing about a movement. See, it's called the prime mover. And you got the antagonist that can slow down or stop the movement. So make sure you know, in terms of certain movements, which ones are the prime movers, the agonists, which ones are the antagonists. So in terms of knee flexion, we'll use that one right there. The hamstrings, the prime mover in knee flexion. The quadriceps are the prime mover in knee extension. I'm sorry. In knee flexion, hamstrings are the prime mover, the agonist. The antagonist would be the quadriceps. In the extension, the quadriceps would be the agonist. Hamstrings would be the antagonist. So those would be an example. And you got synergist, and these are muscles that assist indirectly in the movement. A lot of times their synergists are stabilizing muscles, or like in the shoulder, for instance. Those who have me for biomechanics, we cover this, but if you haven't had it yet, you'll get it when you get in that class. But with the shoulder, you have the shoulder girdle, so that's the scapula, and then you have the glenohumeral joint. So that's the joint where basically the shoulder joint, the humerus goes into the scapula itself. And so a lot of your shoulder girdle muscles don't directly help out with your glenohumeral joint movements, but what the shoulder girdle muscles do is that they basically tighten up and they add a base of support that then those glenohumeral joint muscles then have strong support that could provide force against. So they're working in synergy. So the shoulder girdle muscles work in synergy with the glenohumeral joint muscles that allows for then the shoulder to have such a wide range of motion. So that's what synergists are, is they assist in helping out with movement. And then going on with that, make sure you know what origin and insertions are. Your origin is the proximal attachment, so towards the center of the body. The insertion is the distal, so away from the center of the body. The origin is the least movable part of the muscle. The insertion is the most movable. And when the muscle contracts, it shortens up, pulling the insertion point up to then the origin. So origins don't move, the insertion point does move. And so what happens is when the muscle contracts, pulls on the insertion point, which the insertion, well, make sure you know this, both origin and insertion are attached to the bones. Okay, and so when how movement occurs is you have two bones attaching at we'll get into this coming up here in a bit with levers and the three types, but when you have two bones connecting at a joint and way movement occurs is there's an angle between those two bones at that joint right there. And essentially as a muscle pulls on one bone to the other, it then decreases, it causes that angular motion between those two bones. And remember, as that angular motion takes place, that turns into then a linear motion. And it's the working of how the insertion point pulling towards the origin, causing those two bones to move closer together, that angular motion that turns then into a linear motion. And so that's how the skeletal and muscular systems work together right there. And so levers is a type of, there's three types of machines in the body. You got levers, pulleys, and wheels and axles. And it says many muscles in the body do not act through levers, but many do. The lever is just a rigid long piece that rotates amongst an axis. That's the definition of a lever. And you can see down at the bottom it says rigid or semi-rigid body that's subject to a force whose line of action does not pass through a pivot point. Exerts force on any object impeding its tendency to rotate. So lever is something that's hard and rotates amongst the axis. And that's the most common machine in the body. And once again, a machine should be defined as anything that gains you a mechanical advantage. And so so many muscles are working with the skeletal system through these levers that does allow us to have that movement. So just know the basic definition of a lever. We'll get into then the three types of levers coming up here. There's the first, second, and third class lever. Those are the three types. It says a lever can transmit force tangential to the arc of rotation from one contact point along the object's length to another. And you can see how that's represented at the bottom down there. And you've got a number of components that all go into how this machine works. So first thing is you can see the fulcrum. Fulcrum is the axis of rotation. So think of fulcrum as, well, it is, the joints are fulcrums. And you can see the lever going across right there. That's the bones. So some other components here, you got FA. So that's the force applied to the lever, also known as the force arm. I'm sorry, not the force arm. That's something else. I'll get that here in a sec. So force applied to the lever. That would be actually the muscular force. And you got moment arm of the applied force. And that's the distance between that force application. So where the force is being applied to the axis of rotation. So think of, like I said, FA is not, I apologize, it was not the force arm. I got a little ahead of myself there. The moment arm of the force, that would be the force arm. Sometimes that's what's called. Moment arm, force arm, called very similar. They're the same thing. And that's the distance between the applied force and the axis of rotation. So when you're looking at this component, you're looking at the force applied. So the FA would be essentially the muscle force. So that's the muscle attaching on the bone via the tendon, pulling up through its line of force. The line of force is just the line of force going from basically insertion to origin. And then you got the distance between that and the axis of rotation. Along with that, then you have the force resisting the lever's rotation. Do you see the FR? That's, just think of the resistive force. That is some kind of weight you're trying to move. Or it depends. That's going to be the center of gravity of whatever's trying to be moved, whether it's you trying to move like a weight, or if you're moving just moving your limbs around, it would be the center of gravity of that limb that's moving. And so that's known as a resistive force. Then you got the moment arm of resistive force. Sometimes it's known as the resistive arm. It says the lever applies a force on the object equal in magnitude but opposite in direction of the force of the FR. And so you're looking at that as the distance between then the center of gravity of the force and the axis of rotation. So more or less the four components you have here is you have the force, the applied force, the moment arm of force, the distance between the applied force and the center of the axis of rotation. Then you have the resistive force and the moment arm of the resistive force, which is the distance between the center of gravity of the resistant force and the axis of rotation. And how all these are arranged will determine if you're able to gain a mechanical advantage or not. So, such as if resistance force goes up, in order to move an object, you have to then apply more force. If resistance stays the same and you can't move the resistance by the applied force, you could then extend out the moment arm of the applied force. So you ever notice, like if you're trying to change a tire, you can't get a lug nut off, you try and crank the wrench and it won't turn, but you put like a breaker bar over that and then it's easier to pop that lug nut off. Well, you've increased the resistance or the force arm at that point. So there's ways you can manipulate how to gain a mechanical advantage. It's either going to apply more force or reduce the resistive force, reduce the moment arm of the resistive force, or you can increase the moment arm of the force arm. There's all different ways you can manipulate up how to gain a mechanical advantage. And that is defined as the ratio of the moment arm through which an applied force acts to that through which a resistive force acts. Mechanical advantage could just be basically overcoming a resistance or applying a force to overcome a resistance. If you can apply a force to overcome a resistance, then you've gained a mechanical advantage. It says greater than 1 means a person can apply less, so as muscle force, than a resistance force to produce an equal amount of torque. They haven't defined torque, but torque is a rotational force. And torque is created, once again, like I was saying earlier, about when two bones are moving close together due to the shortening of a muscle. Torque is developed, is a product of those two levers moving closer to one another. So it's an angular force, rotational force, I should say. You got less than 1, means a person must apply greater muscle force than the amount of resistive force present, creating a disadvantage for the muscle. You could kind of, well, this is why we have the different lever systems, and going through them, you can determine which one is a beneficial lever and which one is not so much. So we have, like I said, 3 levers, and it's first, second, and third class levers. The most common in the body is third class, and we'll see here in a sec. Third class gains, we have a very little mechanical advantage using that lever. That's a reason why, based upon how that lever system's set up, in order to move small resistance, you have to apply a lot of force. Hence why it's important to have a proper strength and conditioning program. It allows you to, the only way you can apply more force is by getting stronger. Second class levers, we'll see in a sec. Very few in the body, but then second class levers do give us, we have a very high amount of mechanical advantage with that lever system. A good example of a second class lever would be a wheelbarrow. If you ever have to move dirt, rock around, a wheelbarrow allows you to apply a little force to carry a high resistance. First class lever, more or less, is kind of in that middle. Okay, we don't have too many of them, but it's not as much. You're not going to get as much of a mechanical advantage as levers. Second class lever, nowhere as bad as the third class. Okay, so there's kind of just the overview of those 3. Here's how you know which one is which. And so it says a lever for which the muscle force and resistance force act on the opposite sides of the fulcrum. And you can see at the bottom down there, the elbow joint, the black dot, that's the fulcrum, that's the joint. And so you see on one side is the applied force from the muscle, and on the other side is the resistance force. And you can see just that could be something in the hand, and that's going to be, well, that won't be unweighted right there. So more or less, a lot of times it's always, we think of moving something within our hand. So just remember where the resistance force is going to be the center of gravity for where most of the mass is centered around. That's what center of gravity is. So whether it be in your hand, if you're holding something, this is shown right here. And if it's unweighted, then it would be the center of gravity of that point from the joint all the way to the tip of the fingers. Wherever the center of gravity is on unweighted limb, that's where the resistance arm distance would be. But for the sake of this one, just go off what they're showing us there in terms of the distances. So that 5 centimeters, the 4 centimeters, that's looking at respectively the applied force to the center of the axis rotation, so the 5 centimeters, and then the center of gravity for resistance to the axis rotation, so that'd be the 40 centimeters. That's the resistance arm. But you can see how both force applications are on either side of the fulcrum. So that's how you know it's a first class lever. This one would be, this would be, well, if you're doing like an overhead tricep extension, that'd be an example of a first class lever. And this one looks like just like your arm is, your upper arm is parallel to the ground and you're just moving the hand back and forth. So I'm not going to really ask too much in terms of an example on these, because how the limb moves and changes, it could change from a first to a third class lever. So you can see just based upon, if you do from mechanical advantage, you're looking at just the ratio between the applied force of the muscle and the resistance force. You get a number of 0.125, so that's less than 1. So you'd have a disadvantage here, which means you don't have that high of a mechanical advantage in that position. Second class lever, this right here is, you can see the foot, look at the gastroc and the soleus, so the calf muscles, getting up on top of the foot right there. It says a lever for which the muscle force and the resistance force act on the same side of the fulcrum, with the muscle force acting through a moment arm longer than through which the resistance force acts. Due to the muscle's mechanical advantage, required muscle force is smaller than the resistance force. And so you could see what defines this up is, you see the axis of rotation is going to be the balls of the foot right there. So up on the toes, that's where the actual axis is taking place, at where the tarsals and the metatarsals. Well, that's actually in the metatarsals right there. So that's the joint you're looking at. And so what defines a second class lever is that the resistance is in between the applied force and that axis of rotation. And why this gains such a high mechanical advantage is because you can see the moment arm of the force, so the distance between applied force and axis of rotation, is much greater than the distance between the resistance force. So that's basically the body weight of the individual going all the way down through the foot. So the resistance force would be that center, that point, the center of gravity of that going into the axis of rotation. So because that moment arm of the force is greater than the moment arm of the resistance, it takes less force to then move the body. That's why the gastrocs, a lot of times you see people go in and do, on a leg press, they could do way more calf and way more weight on calf raises than they can actually leg pressing. So the calves, there's a high amount of mechanical advantage right there because of everything set up. But this also then goes into why calves are so important in most sporting events. Because there's so much explosiveness coming out of this area, especially during running, jumping, lifting, because of the plantar flexion of the ankle. That final bit right there gains so much mechanical advantage. That's why a lot of explosiveness comes from here if you're trying to do like a vertical jump or something along those lines. You got the third class lever. So a lever for which the muscle force and the resistance force act on the same side of the fulcrum, with the muscle force acting through a moment arm shorter than that through which the resistance force acts. So you can see just opposite the second class, where now the moment arm of the force, I should say, the force is in between the fulcrum and the resistance. So because of that, it has a much shorter force arm, so the moment arm of the force, compared to the moment arm of the resistance. And due to that relationship, because that longer moment arm of the resistance, well, it's going to take way more force to be able to move a resistance then. So it takes a lot in this, like here doing a bicep curl, essentially, it takes a lot of force even just to move a small amount of weight. Okay, we may be thinking like, oh, I could curl 20 pounds, 25 pounds. No problem. It feels easy doing that, and it might be, but when you actually look at the physics of it all, the amount of force being generated in the muscle is far greater than the actual amount of force coming from the resistance. And we have to produce so much force to move that small amount just because that's how the nature of the third class lever. And so this is one of the most common levers in the body, but it's the one with the least mechanical advantage. So in order to really overcome resistance, this is why strength and conditioning becomes so important. You have to get stronger. That's the only way you can overcome a resistance a lot easier is by becoming stronger. And so that's why programming is so important in making sure that you are developing that force as an athlete. Then you have the patella. Okay, the patella basically acts as a pulley. And so a pulley, just like you see out in the water, the big barges, and they got the big cranes and all that stuff like that. Well, all those can move so much weight because they have all the pulley system set up, and every time one pulley is added, you gain a mechanical advantage over that resistance. And so the patella acts along with this. And what's happening is you have the quadriceps, all four of them kind of come together into essentially this one ligament, this one tendon, and then attaches over the patella down onto the tibia tuberosity. And so the quadriceps have so much force generations because despite, going along with their physiology and all that aspect, well, because along with the patella and wrapping around there, well, you get this pulley system and you adds in mechanical advantage of the quadriceps. So without the patella, there's no way you'd be able to have as much force generation out of the quadriceps. Okay, so that's why it's so important having that there, is because it basically just adds in to the ability of force that the quadriceps can't produce. So that'd be the example, like I said, of a pulley. Don't really talk about wheels and axles in this chapter, but a major wheel and axle would be the shoulder. And I'm not going to go into too much of that, but at least just give you the example of that. Is the shoulder would be an example of a wheel and axle. And the basis of a wheel and axle is as the axle spins, the wheel has to spin as well. And so because of the nature way that's set up, and it's as the axle, so like the shoulder would be the axle, the wheel would be your hand, essentially. And so as the axle spins, the wheel has to travel the same amount of distance, but in doing so, it adds in speed and range of motion is what a wheel and axle helps out with. So just by the nature of the shoulder joint, that's why we could throw a fastball so fast, is because of the nature of the shoulder joint being a wheel and axle machine. And I'll leave it at that because the book doesn't go into any detail on that, so don't want to add any more than that right there. So looking at moment arm and mechanical advantages. So during elbow flexion with the biceps muscle, the perpendicular distance from the joint axis of rotation to the tendon's line of action varies throughout the range of joint motion. It says when the moment arm is shorter, there's less mechanical advantage. You can see kind of just throughout the range of motion right there, and think of when you're doing a bicep curl, the difficult points of when that is. And that's usually, you always hear that sticking point when you're trying to lift. So you can see that very far one on the left, you can see small compared to the other ones. Well, that moment arm is small, so it's hard, it's you don't have as much mechanical advantage there, so it's hard to overcome that resistance unless you apply a lot of force. And that's what we refer to as like the sticking point. Once you kind of start initiating movement, you got that. You start to move a little bit, but then it gets harder, and then eventually, boom, you could lift through the motion. Well, there's where you've increased that moment arm as you go through the range of motion, and then less force is needed, so it allows you to overcome that resistance. It says as a weight is lifted, the moment arm through which the weight acts, and thus the resistance torque, changes with the horizontal distance from the weight to the elbow. And you can see just as it's going through right there, and this is looking then, think of this also a lot with the resistance as well. Okay, and looking at this point, the last one was a force moment arm, now we're looking at the resistance moment arm. And as you get out to that sticking point, you can see, I guess it'd be, once you move away from the body, I'm hard to describe this without, I guess, seeing me with the slides here, but when that weight is straight out from you at 90 degrees, right before there's where you get through the sticking point. That's because at that point, that's where the resistance moment arm is getting to be the greatest. And so it gets hard to lift through that, and that's why as you train, you're like, oh, I'm getting stronger. Well, you're able to apply more force in the muscle, so you can overcome the fact that that resistance arm is actually increasing. Okay, so this is why it's also important in weightlifting with technique. Okay, so as the best example would be Olympic weightlifting. When you're Olympic weightlifting, you want to keep that bar as close and tight to the body as possible. Okay, because as that bar moves away from the axis rotation, which in Olympic weightlifting, the major axis rotation is the hips. And so as that bar moves away, you have to then apply more force to that weight, and just due to the nature of the moment arms of resistance and the force, as that bar moves away, you have to apply more force to just even control the bar, try and get the bar coming back into the body. Because ideally in Olympic weightlifting, you want as much vertical movement of the bar and as little horizontal movement of the bar as possible. And so you want to keep that bar nice and tight to you, because that'll help you apply more force in getting a vertical movement of the bar as opposed to a horizontal. Usually when that happens, the bar moves away, you're going to miss the lift and not do well. Okay, so that's why technique is so important, because as you control these movements, you're trying to put more force into moving the bar the way it's supposed to be going, instead of just trying to just control the bar. Okay, so just know as that moment arm of the resistance increases, more force is needed to overcome that resistance then, just due to the moment arms getting longer. It says most of the skeletal muscles operate at a considerable mechanical disadvantage. As I've been saying, most time we're at a disadvantage, so to get that advantage, we have to get stronger. It says thus, during sport and other physical activities, forces in the muscles and tendons are much higher than those exerted by the hands or feet on external objects or the ground. So training becomes so important. It's due to one, to overcome the mechanical advantage like I've been talking about. That's why training becomes important. But also, we forget the amount of forces applied to the tendons. Okay, your soft tissue, tendons, ligaments can only take so much force before there's some kind of tearing or rupturing. And so training becomes important because, one, we always think, we're just getting my muscles stronger, which is true. So that's an important point there. But also, training also helps those soft tissue get stronger as well. We'll see that coming up in the next chapter. So it becomes important to keep training because it allows then the overall more force generation in the skeletal muscle system that allows them to overcome these resistances. It says tendon insertion. It says the point at which tendons are attached to bone. Tendon insertion farther from the joint center results in the ability to lift heavier weights. This arrangement results in the loss of maximum speed. This arrangement reduces the muscle's force capability during faster movements. There's a difference between the tendon insertion of the biceps on the radial tuberosity as opposed to your rotator cuff muscles, which basically insert on the greater and lesser tubercle of the humerus. Okay, if you look at the distance, the radial tuberosity is much further away from the axis rotation, that is the elbow joint, as opposed to the rotator cuff muscles, which basically attach up and over the humerus, but very, very not that far past that actual joint itself where the humerus goes in the scapula. Okay, I can lift way more weight doing bicep curls than I can doing external or internal rotation of the shoulder. Okay, those muscles are not, the rotator cuff muscles are not meant to move heavy weight. They're meant for stability and security of the glenohumeral or the humerus into the scapula. Okay, so that's just kind of basic architecture of the skeletal muscle system. It says changes in joint angle with equal increments of muscle shortening. It says the tendon is inserted closer to the joint center. You see an A. And then B, the tendon is inserted farther from the joint center. It says configuration B has a larger moment arm and thus greater torque for a given muscle, but less rotation per unit of muscle contraction and thus slower movement speed. So just kind of know, like in the previous slide, just know the relationship between, when you're looking at the force moment arm, kind of just relationship between, where the insertion point is and how that impacts in force production and speed and movement. Planes and major body movements. So there's 3 planes the body moves in anatomical position. You can see here's the anatomical position, looking straight ahead. Palms or arms at the side, palms facing out towards the anterior. And so when you're in the sagittal plane, that slices the body into left and right sections. You can see the sagittal plane going right there, going to an equal left and right section. The frontal plane slices the body into front and back sections, so an anterior and posterior. And then you got the transverse into an upper and lower section, so superior and inferior portion. So those are the 3 planes of motion that the body moves through. Here's all the major body movements. I'm not going to go over them, but you should know these. So make sure you go over all of them. Make sure you know what they are. Okay, I could ask about them, but you've had them before a number of times. So make sure you go through these. Make sure you're familiar and you understand these movements here. Basic definitions. Well, one is strength. This is capacity to exert force at any given speed. So we're talking about how strong somebody is. We're talking about then, well, how much force can somebody generate? And especially at a given speed, because we're talking within athletics, how much force, but then how fast you apply upon that force. That gets into essentially power. We'll get into that here in a sec. Then you get acceleration. So this is a change in velocity per unit of time. Acceleration is any time there's a change in position, acceleration is taking place. And we're looking, like it says, per unit of time. So we're looking, think of, well, as a sprinter's coming out of the blocks, there's an acceleration phase. Essentially, how fast are they changing their position? As a runner or wide receivers going for a route, as they plant and cut and turn, acceleration is looking at then how fast are they able to change that position right there. So those are examples of acceleration. And then this gets into Newton's second law, which is force equals mass times acceleration. Then you got positive work and power. And so power says outside the scientific realm, and what they mean by this is especially within strength and conditioning, power is, and it says loosely defined as explosive strength. So going back to what I said earlier, strength is how much force can you exert at a given speed. And when we're looking at power, that gets into power essentially is kind of at that point right there. How much force and how fast. Because within power, speed is a major component of power production. And so within the field of strength and conditioning, we'll talk, if you're explosive strength, that's what they're looking at as power production. Within biomechanics, the actual scientific area, power is looking at work over time. That's the actual definition of power. It's how much work is done and how fast it's being performed. And you got work, so it's the product of force exerted on an object and the distance the object moves in the direction the force is exerted. So work is force times displacement. Displacement and distance are similar but also very different. So displacement is the distance from point A to point B, when point B is not the starting place of point A. Okay, so what that means is displacement is how far you're finishing from where you started, assuming that you're not finishing up where you actually started. I know it sounds confusing, but an example would be, let's use a 100-meter sprint, for instance. When the sprinter gets finished with the 100 meters, they have finished in a place different from the starting point. So their displacement is 100 meters. And their distance is 100 meters. Those are the same right there. Distance is how far they traveled. Now, let's say you want to go for a jog just around the track, and you start off on just one of the markers there, and you run around, and then you run one complete lap, and you finish the exact same footprints that you started. That's a point where your displacement would be zero because you started and finished where you were at the same spot. Your distance would be the total distance that you ran around the track. So that would be where they'd be different right there. So in terms of like Olympic weightlifting, for instance, and powerlifting, those are some good examples where technically in powerlifting, well, the problem is, I should go back. Those words are used incorrectly, because in Olympic weightlifting, You're not lifting as much weight as you are in powerlifting, but Olympic weightlifting, because the time component, because you go to power, work over time, the amount of work being performed in such a short amount of time, you produce more power in Olympic weightlifting than you do for powerlifting. So you look at the times it takes to complete one squat, one bench, one deadlift, it's vastly longer than it takes to complete. Well, if you look at really good Olympic weightlifters, especially during the snatch, they'll have the bar from ground to overhead in less than a second. They're not lifting as much as those in powerlifting are, but because of how fast they actually lift and how fast it takes to perform a movement, there's greater power output than there is in Olympic weightlifting than powerlifting. And if you want to be technical, powerlifting, there'd be zero work being performed because you squat, as you bench, and as you deadlift, you're starting where you stopped. I'm sorry, that makes no sense. You're stopping where you started. So technically, displacement would be zero. So therefore, force times zero displacement would be zero work performed, so therefore zero power. But that's looking at mechanical work, not physiological work. If that makes sense there. That's where you get extra nerdy and go off on tangents like I just did. But the point I want you to remember is when you're looking at power output, explosive strength, this power, it all comes back to a time component. The more work you can perform in a short amount of time, the more power is going to be developed. That's why I think Olympic weightlifting is such a great tool, such a great exercise for all athletes, is because that's one exercise that you really develop a lot of power because of the amount of work and the time it takes to perform that work. Okay, that's my rant. Then you have negative work, so work performed on rather than by a muscle. Like example, this would be eccentric muscle actions, so the lengthening up of a muscle. And then angular work and power, it's the same thing as linear. It's just moving in the rotational aspect. So it says the angle through which an object rotates. This is rotational work is torque, and then angular displacement. It's the same thing as what we defined earlier. Now we're just looking at the rotational instead of the linear. This is although the word strength is often associated with slow speeds, and the word power with high velocities of movement, both variables reflect the ability to exert force at a given velocity. So it's just important to know the different definitions of these and just kind of be familiar with what it is we're kind of talking about with that. And the bottom point I've already talked about, so I'm not going to go into it anymore. Anymore than we just did, but just be familiar with these terms and how they should be actually being used. So looking at factors in human strength, one big time is neural control. So one thing that happens through training programs is recruitment of motor units. So you start to recruit more motor units. The more you recruit, the more force production could take place because you're having more cross-bridge interactions. Also rate coding, firing frequency of the nervous system. Okay, these two factors affect force production. Okay, you either recruit more motor units or you increase the firing rate. Most likely you're going to recruit more motor units because the nervous system can fatigue out pretty quick. So a lot of ways you'll recruit as many motor units as you can and maintain a constant firing rate. That way you could preserve the neural system and you get the more force production by recruiting the more motor units. Over time, it says muscle cross-sectional area. This is essentially, as we get stronger and we get bigger, the greater the cross-sectional area, the greater force production of a muscle, because it's just basically more mass in a given area. The more mass in a given area means more cross bridges, essentially more cross bridges, more force production, therefore a stronger individual. Also, the arrangement of muscle fibers. So you got pinnate muscles, which goes into, when you're looking at pinnate muscles, those are the ones that get that greater cross-sectional area. Because pinnation is is you're looking at how the muscles are attaching to the tendon. And muscles that have a pennate orientation are ones that look, like it says, like feather-like arrangement. You have this feather-like arrangement of the fibers attaching to the tendon. And then from there, what we'll look at is the angle of pennation. And that's the angle between the muscle fibers and this imaginary line between the muscle's origin and insertion. If there's zero, responds to no pennation. And we'll see on the next slide right here, like some muscle at the very bottom, the fusiform. You see F, like the biceps brachii. No pennation there, as opposed to the ones on the right. You got the multi, bi, and unipennate. Those ones have that feather-like arrangement. So therefore, those are the ones that will have a much greater cross-sectional area. Those are generally muscles that have a lot more force production capabilities. You can see the middle one, the bipennate, the rectus femoris. One, the quadriceps is a very large force-producing muscle. Okay, so just know those different terms. You got radiate, longitudinal, fusiform, and know kind of just the examples. You can see them on here as well. So muscle lengths, primarily resting length. It says actin, myosin filaments lie next to each other. Maximal number of potential cross-bridge sites are available. The muscle can generate the greatest force. And then muscle length when stretched. Does a smaller portion of the actin, myosin filaments lie next to each other? Fewer potential cross-bridge sites are available. The muscle cannot generate as much force. Muscle length when contracted. The actin filaments overlap. The number of cross-bridge sites reduced. There's a decreased force generation capability. And this is basically looking at, and those who have me for ex-phys talked a lot about this. Okay, in order to generate as much force within the cross bridge, you want to have a proper overlapping of the myosin and actin proteins there. And so there's going to, and when it comes to force production, the more cross bridge attachments, the more force that will be produced. And if the muscle is stretched out, there's basically no overlapping, so there's no interaction between the two. Or if the muscle is shortened up, and that's why a muscle can only produce so much force when shortened, is because they start to essentially, if they get too shortened up like that, then there's just, one starts to push, one starts to pull, basically. And you start to get one pushes, one pulls, there's a result of zero. Okay, so to produce that force, you want to have just the right, and this is those who have made for ex-phys talk about Goldilocks, the right overlapping between the two. That will allow for the greatest cross-bridge attachment, the greatest amount of myosin-actin interaction. Joint angle says the amount of torque depends on force versus muscle length, leverage, type of exercise, the body joint question, the muscles used of the joint, and the speed of contraction. Okay, and that's just when you're looking at that joint. Okay, good example, I was trying to think right there, would be if you're trying to push somebody. There's what I'm getting at right now. I was trying to think of the example. My brain was kind of whatever. If I'm going to push somebody, I'm not going to just stick my arms out and push them, right? Like an offensive lineman. Okay, I'm going to set up. I'm going to basically pull my arms, back in a tractor position, and I'm changing up these joint angles, changing up the muscle length, and all that going in, because that's going to then add in to the overall force I can produce and how fast I can produce that. So offensive linemen, if they're going to, run block or block somebody, they're keeping their arms back to then allow that to be placed in the spots where they could push somebody. Okay, so we could gain in this advantage, get stronger based upon then how we change up how the body is moving. Okay, and there's another, you also could change this up, and that's why it's important just not to do one exercise essentially in the weight room, because we do a wide array of movements because we're trying to train the body throughout the full range of motion. Okay, you think of the offensive lineman ready to push somebody. Well, they're moving through a lot of range of different range of motion, but also different movement angles. So to get the best development, that's why you do train overall, each muscle, each segment throughout a different movement pattern, because it helps add into the overall development of the body. So then muscle contraction velocity is nonlinear, but in general, the force capability of muscle declines as the velocity of contraction increases. And this is just a force-velocity relationship. As velocity goes up, force capability goes down. And the goal is to have as much, and the reason why is because, as we learned in the last, I talked about that, I believe, one of the previous lectures, but if not, I can't keep everything, my brain can't remember what I talked about, what I haven't, but what happens is as velocity increases, the force goes down because there's less ability to make the actin and myosin interaction. And the goal is to have as much power as possible is by having the greatest amount of cross-bridge attachments at the preferred velocity. That's kind of the goal, because you never want 100% force because you have zero velocity, and vice versa. There's an inverse relationship here. So you want to be able to produce the desired amount of force at a great enough velocity that'll give you the most power output. And then there are 3 types of muscle actions for joint angular velocity. And these ones you've heard probably, I don't know how many times now. Concentric, eccentric, and isometric. Okay, so you should know those by now. I'm not going to cover those because we should know these at this point. Here's a force velocity curve I just talked about. You have that inverse relationship. You see at the bottom would be the velocity, and then the y-axis would be the torque, so that's the force, and it's just the inverse relationship. As one goes up there, one goes down. But you see eccentric training, though, you have a greater force production than concentric. That's because velocity is negative. So therefore, force is increased to its highest amount it possibly can within the muscle. And also, well, that's why, because of this right here, you get so sore after eccentric training. And also eccentric training, a lot of times you're also doing way more weight than you would during a concentric work. But nonetheless, you get really super sore after eccentric just due to this high amount of force production within the muscle itself. So strength to mass ratio, you want to make sure that there's a proper ratio between the strength of the body and the mass. Problem is, when we're talking about mass, we're not just talking about muscle mass. When you get bigger, there might not be muscle coming in with that. It might be some fat. So you got to be careful that you're not, and this is where everyone's always saying, get our alignment as big as possibly can. Well, gaining that mass is good as long as strength is going up along with it. And you want to at least have an equal strength to mass increase as much as possible. But if somebody's getting too big and they're getting stronger, but there's a greater percent of mass related to the strength, then you're not going to be as good. It's not going to be a beneficial attribute to you as an athlete. You see right here in sprinting and jumping, the ratio reflects an athlete's ability to accelerate his or her body. Well, I mean, that's not a bad thing if you're getting stronger and getting a little bigger, because as you get the muscle mass, you are getting more cross-bridge attachments. So that's why the mass is good, because that's where if you're gaining muscle mass, that's a beneficial thing because you're adding more cross bridges, but then you're also adding in the strength as well. the stronger athlete is always going to be better than the weaker athlete. That's a no-brainer. So in most sporting events, the better you can move your body, the better you're going to be. But you got to make sure that that mass is coming from is a lean mass increase, not a fat mass increase. It says in sports involving weight classification, the ratio helps determine when strength is highest relative to that or athletes in the weight class. So, if you are gaining more, like I said, gain more weight, then it does help out with strength production. But you see a lot of these guys, especially in Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting, they put on a lot of weight and they get stronger, but not nearly what they should be. But the strength to mass ratio is good because in a lot of sports, especially Olympic weightlifting, they take into account in a weight class itself. Let's say two people are tied for first in Olympic weightlifting. They both totaled out in the snatch and the clean and jerk at, I'll just make it easy, 400 kilos. They both totaled out. They both did, and it doesn't matter. They both had a total. That's all that matters in Olympic weightlifting is what's your total weight at the end of the day. Well, if that happens, what they'll do is they'll look at the mass of each individual. Let's say they're both training in the 85 kilo class. Competing in the 85 kilo class. They both total out 400 kilos. Lifter A was 84.5 kilos. That's what he weighed in at. And lifter B weighed in at 84.2 kilos. Well, the lifter who weighed in less, even though it's 0.2 kilos, they're going to have a greater strength to mass ratio, so therefore they'll be the ones that win that competition. So that's why this ratio helps out, and that's why you look at a lot of these Olympic weightlifters who don't weigh that much, but they can lift so much weight, is because in that small amount of mass they have their muscles are essentially just way more dense. So they have a greater cross-sectional area, more cross-bridge attachment, and more ability to produce force. So I am a firm believer in athletes. I don't believe in getting athletes as big as possible because it doesn't always translate into a stronger, more powerful athlete. Okay, I'm a believer that athletes should be, they don't have to have 6% body fat, but I am a believer that athletes should be as lean as possible. Even offensive linemen, get offensive linemen as strong as they possibly can without adding in the unwanted mass. And that's just kind of thoughts on there. But nonetheless, the goal is to gain that strength when gaining mass, but assuming that the strength or the mass percent increase doesn't far outweigh the percent increase in strength, because that's not going to be a benefit at that point. That's kind of what body size increases are down there. All right, I've talked about that one, all those down there, so I'm not going to go over that. So the sport activities such as sprinting and jumping, the ratio of strength of the muscles involved in the movement to the mass, the body parts being accelerated is critical. Thus, the strength to mass ratio directly reflects an athlete's ability to accelerate his or her body. And the technique can affect the resistive torque pattern during an exercise and can shift stress among muscle groups. I believe when you are training to use free weights as much as possible, because in sports you're moving against gravity at all times. You're moving yourself against gravity, you're moving an object against gravity, or you're moving a person against, a person could be an object too, I guess. You're moving something else against gravity. So I believe you should train as close to that as possible. That's why I'm a believer in free weights over machines for strength and conditioning. Okay, because one, you got to overcome that gravity and all that, but you're also, when you're on the platform moving a barbell, you're trying to move that object and yourself in one fashion. Okay, it's same thing on the field. You're trying to move an object in your body, and so you're having to have all these different stresses coming in at one time, so you should train that way as well. That's why I'm a believer in barbell exercises, dumbbells, free weights, and also the Olympic weightlifting, big time. Where I talked about, it says when the weight is horizontally closer to the joint, it exerts less resistive torque. When the weight is horizontally farther from the joint, it exerts more resistive torque. Okay, that's why I talked about that, making sure that resistant arm doesn't get too long out there because it will impact how you can move that weight. So you got weight stack machines. It says gravity is a source of resistance, but machines provide increased control over the direction and pattern of resistance. That's why machine work, you can lift way more weight than barbells or free weights, is because one, machines have pulleys, which add in mechanical advantage, and two, you're not having to control the resistance like you would in free weight exercises. So that's why I think machine work should be used only as like some kind of accessory workout work or rehabilitation type work, things of that nature. Okay, and that's what the bottom just talks a little bit more about that, but essentially that's what we talked about is just weight stacks. They change up the resistant torque, and therefore allows you to gain that mechanical advantage because less force is needed to move that resistance. And so when coming to moving an object though, and this gets into Newton's laws of motion and trying to move an object, like force equals mass times acceleration, all that, well, one you have to deal with is inertia. Inertia is the object's resistance to change. So an object that has a greater mass has a greater inertia because the greater mass has a greater resistance to change its motion than the smaller, or an object with a smaller mass. So that's what inertia is. It says though the force of gravity acts only downward, inertial forces can act in any direction. However, upward or lateral acceleration of the weight requires additional force. And so, inertia, like I said, an object's ability to resist a change in motion. So to overcome that, a lot of times more force is needed to move that object. So that's another reason why you need to get stronger in a proper fashion though. You got friction. So friction is a resistive force encountered when one attempts to move an object while it's pressed against another object. So when two objects, like I said, two objects are on top of one another, friction is that it's a resistive force. And some friction is good, like cleats and those kind of shoes. You want some kind of friction because it adds in that resistive force, but it allows you to then transmit more force into moving there. You wouldn't want to be going out and doing sprints wearing shoes you'd wear during like bowling, for instance, smooth base shoes, because there's no friction there. It's not going to add in any kind of traction. But friction is the ability to the resistance force to move. But once an objects are moving, the friction forces go down. So the example in the book, they talked about running with a sled pull or things like that, running with a tire. Well, it's harder to get going, but once you're going, it's not so hard to run with a tire or pushing the sled. It's that resistive force you have to overcome. Because of that, though, that's why we use these objects, because that all adds in the development and training of the athlete. Then you have fluid resistance. This is a resistive force encountered by an object moving through a fluid. And remember, fluid is a liquid or a gas. It says, or by a fluid moving past or around an object or through an opening. So obviously liquid fluids, it'd be swimming or rowing. Those are probably the simplest ones that everyone probably thinks of. But move for a gas, that is through air, The book talked about a pitcher, disc thrower, golfer, okay, object moving through that fluid, and based upon that air, that's going to change up then the object's movement through that air. Okay, it's those who play in Coors Field, or like hitting a ball is another example. So there's less air resistance in Coors Field in Denver than there is in anywhere else in the country, because Denver's at 5,000 feet. And so more home runs are hit in Coors Field generally is because the ball has less resistance moving through that air than it does in, let's say, Houston, where the air is then a lot more dense and also more humidity. So that's going to change up then those projectiles. Elasticity says more elastic component stretch, the greater the resistance. And so those are all just examples of resistance to muscle contraction. Careful though, as we train, there's always those common injuries that come about. So one is the main one, be back and shoulders. So you see here the back injury. It says the lower back is particularly vulnerable. Resistance training exercises should generally be performed with the lower back in a moderately arched position. When you watch my Olympic weightlifting videos, you will see I talk about in there how with the proper starting position in Olympic weightlifting, you should have the low back concaved a little bit. So you want, there's a little bit of an arch there, okay? And so that helps put the back in a proper position for doing movements. You never want to have that low back rounded outwards at all, because that puts a lot of strain on those joints. And so the biggest thing is help out with this though is then you see the bottom, the intra-abdominal pressure. Okay, when we lift, we need to make sure we take a deep breath in and hold our abs tight. The best way to do that is think of, if I was to walk up and punch you in the stomach, you would tighten up your abs to absorb that shock. Okay, that's how we should be lifting, keeping that abdominals nice and tight. Lifting belts help out with as well, which we'll get in those. We'll talk about lifting belts later on, but I guess I'm not a fan of lifting belts unless you're lifting heavy. Let me put it that way. Because people get a false sense of security by using a belt, and they think they go heavier than their actual strength or technique allows for. So with training, making sure that you have, you see that down there, the inner abdominal pressure, talks about the fluid ball, which we'll see in the next slide. So this adds tightening up between the ab muscles and the diaphragm. Basically a natural weightlifting belt, you could put it. It keeps that lower portion all nice and tight and secure. It allows you to train and keep in those positions without getting injured, assuming you don't lift too heavy and still lift with that proper technique. Here's the fluid ball. It says the contraction of the deep ab muscles and the diaphragm. So it keeps that portion tight. And you see the lifter's low back is rounded inwardly, so concaved a little bit. That's the proper technique. And that's for Olympic lifting, for squatting, deadlifts, all that. There's how you could keep from hurting the low back, assuming, once again, when the problem is what happens when people go too heavy is that they go heavy, but then technique breaks down. So you should never lift more. You should never add weight and sacrifice technique at any time. You'll be stronger in the long run, better in the long run, if you keep training with proper technique and allow the weight to go up in a fashion that keeps that with that technique. So never sacrifice technique by adding weight. Valsalva maneuver. So this is where the gluteus is closed, thus keeping air from escaping the lungs. That's why I said earlier, when you go to lift, you take a deep breath in, because that will keep all the pressure equalized in the body. You see the muscles of the abs and the rib cage contract, creating rigid compartments of liquid in the lower torso and air in the upper torso. What this is doing is making sure the pressure basically inside your vessels on the outside are about the same. Because when you lift, pressure does increase quite significantly. And that's why if you ever lifted and you kind of get done, you kind of get lightheaded, it's because sometimes you have your vasculature collapses. And it gets you lightheaded a little bit because blood's not getting quite up to the brain. But the Valsalva maneuvers where you take a deep breath, and they always say do this only if you're trained, learn how to do this. But when you all come in for the lap portion, I'm going to teach you how to do this. Okay, the Valsalva maneuver is a natural tendency we do if we go to lift something heavy. We take a deep breath in because it keeps the pressure equalized. It allows you to move through. And so what people fear is like doing the Valsalva maneuver where you hold your breath. People are like, well, you're holding your breath and you're not getting air in. It's like, well, that's true somewhat, but you need to hold the breath in through the hard part of the movement, and then as you're then contracting to go through the concentric portion, then you start to let the air out. And make sure you breathe between each rep. There's where people mess up, is they hold their breath through like multiple reps and then they pass out. It's like, well, yeah, that's not the proper way to do it. So with executing the Valsalva maneuver, you take a deep breath in through the initial part of the movement. And once you get through the sticking point, or once you go into the sticking point, the hard part of the movement through the concentric phase, you start to let the air out. So if I was squatting, I take a deep breath in, going down. That sticking point is right when you come up out of the squat. There's where you start to let the air out as you're going through that concentric portion. Other areas, shoulders, knees, and elbows. Make sure you warm up all these areas. A good warm-up will start getting the synovial fluid released, lubricating up the joints, making sure shoulders. A lot of times people do way too much weight in the shoulders. Try not to do too much on there. The knees, like it says, minimize use of wraps. Wraps should only be used, I don't think. Knee sleeves are one thing, kind of keeps everything nice and tight. But knee wraps, if you watch powerlifters do it, that it really cuts off a lot of circulation, but it does help out with lifting. Okay, knee wraps do add in a lot of bounce to the movement. That's why they use them. If you're outside of powerlifting, you shouldn't be using knee wraps. Elbows and wrist. A lot of overhead athletes have trouble with this. So with training, I think baseball players and pitchers, they steer away way too much for overhead lifting because they're afraid of the elbows getting damaged and the shoulder as well. But I'm a believer that you should still do overhead lifting for these athletes. It's just you don't go super heavy. You still should add in some kind of overhead work because it just, going back earlier, we move our body through a lot of joint angles, a lot of different velocities, different forces. So we should keep training the body, and we could do it that way. We could train overhead in different ways, maintaining the strength, getting the power development, but also then doing a safe way we're not injuring ourselves. So don't steer away from those type of lifting. So the key point, the risk of injury from resistance training is low compared to that with other sport and physical conditioning activities. Okay, we should not steer away from any kind of resistance training at all. Okay, this is from a health perspective and a strength and conditioning perspective. Reason why people get injured is not because of the movements. Okay, squat and deadlift is a natural human movement, so that shouldn't injure us. How we approach those movements is what gets us injured. Okay, lifting with bad technique, lifting too much weight. Okay, the squat, for instance, everyone's always afraid of going super low to the ground. They think it hurts the knees, and that's not true. Look at a lot of studies. More force is applied to the knee when you stop above parallel than when you go past parallel. And so don't be afraid to lift through the full range of motion. Okay, why we get hurt is because we do things incorrectly. Okay, like I said, if squatting, if deadlift, all these movements are natural human movements, then there's no reason why they're going to get us injured unless we do them incorrectly, which is why people get hurt. So there's a greater risk of hurting yourself, especially in sport and in physical activities, from not lifting than there is from lifting. Okay, so make sure when we're looking at training, resistance training is how we get stronger. That's how we gain a mechanical advantage. And that's what allows us then to get stronger, develop that explosive strength, more powerful, and be an overall better athlete. To conclude with this chapter, know that we're talking about human movement. We're talking about how that's accomplished through the muscles, the bones, the lever system. You got first, second, third class lever. Remember how those are arranged, how those work. Like how movement occurs as the muscle pulls on the bone. Bones move close together, creates torque, and that angular motion between the bones moving together then transmits into like a linear motion. Okay, so just remember how those are working, what those are, and then just overall the concepts: power, strength, looking at how power is sometimes referred to as explosive strength. Strength also is essentially how much force being produced, and just some of those other components that go into resistance. Okay, because we're talking about, with this chapter, remember, it's gaining a mechanical advantage, that is producing enough force to overcome a resistance. And there's a lot of forms of resistance we have to overcome. It's not so much just looking at just a heavy object, but then you have friction, you have talking about inertia and fluid resistance, elasticity, and just know all those different areas, free weights versus machines, how that all comes into play with overcoming that resistance. Okay, but the biggest thing is, remember, the body's a machine. It's a living machine, and we're able to accomplish what we do is because we produce enough force to overcome a resistance. That's gaining the mechanical advantage. Now, remember, I say that, but I know in lectures in the slides it says mostly we're always at a disadvantage, and then that's true. If you look at just the machine itself, every little individual lever system, there's a disadvantage, but we as humans are able to change that up by training. Okay, so we're able to lift, get stronger. That helps us to overcome these resistances. That's why strength and conditioning becomes so important when dealing with motion, is because it allows us to increase mechanical advantage, because we are a being that has always kind of at a disadvantage. So kind of hope that relationship all kind of stays in play right there. Okay, just remember the definitions and just the overall concept of this chapter, what we talked about with the body's a machine, and the machine is used to overcome resistance to gain a mechanical advantage, causes motion.